program provided by the University of Illinois Extension. My name is Russell Medley, Community and Economic Development Educator for the University of Illinois Extension. For sound quality, we will mute microphones during the presentation. If you have any problems connecting, let us know in the chat space. We will be monitoring the chat space, and you can pose comments and questions to our speaker, and we'll do that at the end of the presentation. A recording of the webinar will be made available to on our local government education website and YouTube channel. Participants will receive slides, links to resources, and recording of today's webinar. Today's webinar is using a stress testing approach to measuring the fiscal sustainability of local governments, presented by Dr. Kenneth A. Kriz, who is a University Distinguished Professor of Public Administration at the University of Illinois at Springfield. Dr. Kriz conducts research focused on subnational debt policy and administration, public pension fund management, government financial risk management, economic and revenue forecasting, and behavioral public finance. Dr. Kriz is a frequent presenter at public economics and public budgeting and financial management conferences and has published more than 40 journal articles and book chapters, along with a textbook on quantitative research methods. A textbook on quantitative research methods in public administration, and a co-edited book on tax increment financing that was published by State University of New York Press in July 2019. He has consulted with several public and nonprofit organizations on financial and economic matters, including the cities of Minneapolis, Omaha, New York City, and Wichita, and the states of Nebraska and Kansas. Dr. Kriz served as vice chairperson of the City of Omaha, Nebraska, Civilian Employees Retirement System from 2006 to 2011, and on the Board of Trustees of the Wichita, Kansas Police and Fire Retirement System, and on the Joint Investment Committee for the city's pension funds from 2014 to 2018. Dr. Kriz was a Fulbright Scholar in the Republic of Estonia in 2004 through 2005, and a Fulbright Senior Specialist in the Czech Republic in 2008. So at this time, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Kriz.
Thanks, Russell. Well, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to attend this afternoon. It's I guess, still a sunny day. Unfortunately, my window in my office is behind me, so I can't turn and look. But so thanks for taking some time out and listening to this. I hope we can have a good exchange of information and a discussion about what we have to offer in terms of a new approach to considering the notion of financial or fiscal sustainability of governments, and in this case, particularly local governments in the state of Illinois. So this is based upon some research which I wrote and published a working paper on last year and presented at a couple of academic conferences. But the approach is general. The approach is something that could be employed by any municipality who has data, some data on their finances, in order to assess their ability to withstand problems within the economy, problems of losing revenue sources, any type of a problem that's going to disrupt kind of the natural flow of resources. So when we talk about the concept of fiscal sustainability, this is a forward-looking concept. And a little bit about my background. I have a background in the public sector, but also in the private sector in finance. And one of those very short stints was as a loan officer at a bank. And whenever a business would come in for a loan, one of the very first things that we asked for, aside from a business plan and a marketing plan and all of those things, was a set of pro forma financial statements. So forward-looking financial statements that kind of attempted to get at the notion of, is this business going to be viable and sustainable in the short to medium term, at least. And so when I came into the public sector, I was shocked to find out that wasn't kind of common practice within the public sector, that at most you might present a budget plus 1 year into the future of maybe a forecast or something like that. And so I started working on a number of pieces of research that started looking at this notion of a forward-looking measure of sustainability. So most of the applied research has come before, has involved the development of what's called indicators. So there's numerous papers going back to Ken Brown's paper in 1993 that developed what he called a 10-point test of solvency or fiscal condition. And that's been expanded on. Rebecca Hendrick at the University of Illinois at Chicago is one of the people who's published in this area. Craig Maher and Carl Nolenberger did some work in this area, and then Craig did some other work with a couple of other researchers in 2018. And so typically what they do is they pick out a handful of measures. So they might look at the ratio of revenues to expenditures, the ratio of debt to per capita, or debt as some kind of a measure of revenues, and they try and kind of read the tea leaves and figure out which of these are important measures and which of us really tell something. Now, most of this work isn't well validated. In kind of a technical term, validation to me means does it tell you when you're going to have a problem with sustainability? Does it really kind of look into the future and say there's going to be a problem? The closest thing we have to that is the most recent work by Evgenia Garena, Craig Maher, and Mark Joffe, and they developed a kind of more of a benchmark type of approach to this, where they looked at kind of the trends in some indicators over time. And they were able to predict essentially whether a municipality would have a problem with their finances this year, in the current year. So they kind of did partially a service by getting at which indicators were maybe more powerful, but they only have the ability to forecast out at most 1 year into the future. Most of their work just is apparent for 1 year. Again, it didn't get at this concept of how do we look into the future and at least have some sense about what is really going to happen. Now, there is one exception to this. The Government Finance Officers Association, working with the International City County Management Association, came up with a system called the Financial Trend Management System. They rolled out in the early 2000s. It was documented in a paper by Groves and Valenti in 2004. And it did have kind of they looked at least trends in different indicators. The problem is they kind of stopped and just kind of speculated about what the future was going to hold without getting at any type of a forecast or anything like that to look at what's been going on. In the academic world, there's actually another approach that's been called convergence-divergence analysis, which is a little bit closer to what I'm doing, which is where they look at whether revenues and expenditures are trending together over the long run, so converging, or whether they're diverging, whether they're going away from each other, and giving you a sense about how long that type of trend can work. And so there's a number of papers listed on the last bullet if you want to go and look. I have the full citations available, and they're in the paper that I'm going to reference at the end. If you really want to go out and look. But this is generally done only on aggregated data. They need really long-term data to be able to get at this with any kind of accuracy. And so they generally look at data from the Census Bureau or something, and only on an aggregate level. So they aggregate over all local governments, all states, et cetera. So it has limited usefulness really as an applied tool. And I really wanted to develop something that would at least have some validity and, for individual governments. So our idea, and I should mention at the start, my co-author on this paper is Dr. Rick Funderburg from UIS. He's an associate professor, currently on leave, working for the state of California, doing some research on housing problems there. Um, he's trained as an urban economist. But we came across this idea of stress testing. So stress testing was developed during the 1990s to address instability in financial systems. So, after the Asian financial crisis, after some weaknesses in the savings and loan industry in the United States, it became apparent that what we needed to do was to develop a system for assessing how risky financial systems and financial institutions were. So the first crack at this was the World Bank and IMF. They developed something called the Financial Security Assistance Program, where they looked at systems as a whole. So they looked at kind of country level financial systems and tried to assess whether they were vulnerable to economic downturns. And that was documented in a paper in 2001. Since then, and especially this accelerated during the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. I don't know if you remember, but the Federal Reserve undertook stress testing of the major banks in the United States to try and understand how vulnerable they were, the banks that had what was called systemic risk. They undertook stress tests on those banks, and found really a mixture of things. So that the work with that was documented in a 2014 paper, but it's since been extended to look at actual households in terms of their debt levels. And then most importantly, and something which is related to another topic I do research on, which is public pension systems. The Pew Charitable Trust has done some really good research. Greg Menace and Susan Banta and David Drain have published on using stress testing to assess public pension systems sustainability. And so our approach tries to merge that with some other work that I've done and published research on determining how much in terms of budget reserves governments should have. So what do we do? Well, basically what we do is we build a financial model of a government. So we build a set of pro forma financial statements. We use historical data on economic condition in an area and governmental funds financial information. So it's really information intensive. That's one of the challenges for doing this as an academic, is I have to find some way to have people go into the financial statements and extract the data we need and get it into a database. And then we develop models, and the models are linked. So there's two models. One is a model of the economic condition for an area. And then the second is a model of how that translates, along with historical information on government finances, into a forecast for the future. Now, I want to just take a break here and talk about the difference between projections and forecasts, because given some of the things that I've seen, there's not really an understanding of the difference between the two. So I want to make sure that everybody's clear on this, and this will become apparent as I show you a couple slides in just a second. But the basic difference is projections are a guess at what's going to happen in the future based upon what's happened in the past and some other things potentially, but generally just what's happened in the future. Forecasts incorporate information on other things. So again, we have a model of economic condition and a model of financial information. So it's not just taking the financial information and projecting it into the future, which I've seen presented as forecasts, unfortunately, but it incorporates this other model on economic condition. But the other difference is it includes errors. I do a lot of work in government forecasting. I'm writing a book on it right now. And the main difference is we have models of the errors. And so we can tell how far we're likely to be off given how volatile revenues have been in the past or expenditures have been in the past, along with how good our models are. And that's in large part a function on how much data we have. And so we have the ability to show how much we're likely to be off on any of our forecasts. So we take that information on the errors and we use it to develop our stress for the model. The stress testing in stress basically covers how likely is it we're going to get an error on the bad side. So either revenues below estimates or expenditures above estimates, creating the possibility of having a deficit or having to incur debt in order to provide your services. So this is forward-looking. I've got some caveats at the end. I'm sure you're already thinking about the caveats right now for me. But I'll tell you what I think the caveats are and then present them at the end. But let me first just, to reinforce this notion of the difference between projections and what we do, this is an example of projection. So this is per capita personal income for Carbondale, which is one of the cities in our sample. And this would be an example of a projection technique. And so the red line is historical, just see if I can get a laser pointer here. The red line here is a historical data on what per capita personal income, and this is at the county level. Unfortunately, for a lot of smaller communities, they don't have it at the city level, but it's available at the county level. So this is county level per capita personal income and how it's evolved over time going back to 2000. We actually have that data for several years back to beyond or before 2000, but it lines up with the financial data in terms of 2000. And then you have the projection, which is the blue line. And so you're just kind of drawing a straight line through the data and projecting it out over time. That's a basic projection model. It's what I call a naive model. I know that sounds judgmental. It's not meant to be judgmental. That's the actual technical term for it. It's just naive in the sense that it doesn't incorporate any information other than what the basic trend in the data is. So what we do is we actually develop a forecast. And so you can see a couple of differences. This is the same data. In order to make the end look, not so it wasn't really scrunched down, I abbreviated the data to 2005. But you see the actual data again in red on the left-hand side and the forecast in blue. So our forecast model is able to kind of follow the turns. It looks at how not only the trends evolve, but also the cyclical nature of the revenues, the income in this case, evolve over time. So it's more of a smart forecast. And I'll talk a little bit more about the methods we use in just a second. But you see the result here is we end up with a forecast in the future. And actually, unlike the trend, because of the fact it takes into account past turns in the data, especially this turn in kind of 2010 to 2015, it forecasts another turn, actually a stronger turn out beyond 2020, basically, for per capita personal income. But it also acknowledges that there's some error, and the error is the green bars here. Okay, the error is the green bars. That tells us how much we're likely to be off, and you'll notice that those bars increase over time. Out past 2024, the forecasts probably aren't worth very much. As a forecaster, I'll tell you, you can't go out more than 2 or 3 years until your forecast errors start to really get large compared to what the forecast is. And that's just a reality of not having a crystal ball. But we at least have a measure of how much we're likely to be off. And again, that's driven by two things. Number one, by how much volatility there is. And for per capita personal income, there's not a whole lot of volatility and not a whole lot of ups and downs, but also how well our model fits. And our model fits fairly well to the data. So what does it look like when our model doesn't fit very well? Well, this is another data source. This is for the town of Geneseo. I forget if it's called a town or a village, maybe called the village of Geneseo. About 6,500 population in west central Illinois. This is for their intergovernmental revenue. Now, for some reason, my statistical program spit out the errors not as green bars, but as a gray shade. I have to get up with the graphics people and get this looking a little bit better, or a little bit more consistent at least. But it's the same concept. So on the left-hand side, we have actual, and then our forecast model, and then on the right is the forecast along with the error. So the errors here are much larger. They're almost 100%, not 100%, almost 50% of what the actual revenue is. So it's not a very good forecast. We would never want to use this as a forecast by itself, but that's not the point of this paper. The paper is how much is our error? And again, the things that are driving the error are, first of all, there's a lot of volatility. So they had one year where intergovernmental revenue is really high, another year where it was really low, almost zero, and it's really bounced around a lot. So if you're counting on this as a major revenue source, you're going to have more risk. To put it in bankers' terms, you're going to have more risk going forward. And this is a really small part of their revenue, so I'm not worried about this. This all gets aggregated together to come up with our final measure. But for this source alone, you have a really big risk, and that's one of the things we're trying to get at here, is just how much risk is there. So what we do essentially is, for revenues, is we ignore this top half of the error, because that's, you can think of it as good error. If you get an error that's up here, that's not going to cause you a problem. The problem is if you're down below the forecast. So this is roughly what we call a 2 standard error or 2 standard deviation error below the forecast level. The very bottom of this gray shaded area is 2 standard errors below what the forecast level is. So if you ever took a probability class, please don't take one with me. You'll be even more bored than you already are. There'd be 95% chance or 95% likelihood that a value would fall between plus 2 standard errors and minus 2 standard errors from the mean forecast. So the 1 and 2 standard deviation errors are what we're going to use for our model. So what we do is combine our base forecast with those 1 and 2 standard deviation bad errors. So again, for revenues falling below expectations or forecast, and for expenditures above and below forecast, in order to get our measures of what happens if a stressful event occurs. So for sample cities, right now we have 6 cities only in the sample. We've actually gotten data since then on about 15 or 20 additional cities that we have to put into the sample in order to have more. But again, the one thing I should stress is these are ones that we just picked, and we did a random sampling within each of the population groups. We tried to get a couple of smaller cities and some medium-sized cities, and then a couple of the larger ones. I didn't pick Springfield because it was here necessarily, but I picked it because it came up as a random sample of cities with populations greater than 100,000. So it really was random. This is a very busy slide, and I'm going to tell you the most important data on it is in the right-hand side, and I'll explain why in just a second. If you read through the paper, you get a sense, but these are the economic forecasts that we described. And so for each city, we develop an individual forecast based upon the model that fits the best. And we try out a number of models. This is another thing. If you ever read my revenue forecasting book, and I'm sure it's going to be a bestseller on the New York Times list. Sorry, couldn't help but plug it a little bit. It probably won't appear ever there. But you need to try a number of models to see which model fits best. And so we use a number of models from something like the trend model. In some cases, it fits pretty well for employment, the EMP variable. For normal, the city of normal, that actually fits the best. Whereas other models fit better for different measures and different cities. So this is really kind of a bespoke model that we develop, almost like we're developing individual forecasts for a community. And again, this is something we can do for your community. The variables are in common for all of the cities save for Springfield, which I'll explain for just a second. The economic variables are taxable receipts, so taxable retail sales, per capita personal income, wages, and that's wage and salary reported by the Census Bureau, and employment. And again, this is at the county level. In all of our, we have data on all counties in Illinois, so we're able to develop these pretty regularly. And we use these different models. The data on the right-hand side shows us the error, okay? This is called the mean absolute percentage error. So this is a sense of how wide those error bands are for our data. In general, what we want to see is an error of no more than 3 to 4%. As a forecaster, somebody is drawing on my, somebody has a, anyway, there's an error of 3 to 4% is considered acceptable. So most of our economic models fit pretty well. For normal, the taxable retail sales is not fit very well. It's got a fairly wide error. But I would be comfortable as a forecaster taking most of these forecasts to a city council or something and presenting it like I do with some larger cities. Translating into the financial forecasts, we end up with a really kind of a combination. One of the things I should have mentioned is Springfield, the taxable retail sales fit together better with the financial variables. They behave a lot more like a financial variable than they do an economic variable. I think that's just because Springfield is an attractor of retail sales. And so it has much more of the characteristics of a financial variable. It just worked better if we modeled it together with financial variables versus economic variables. And one of the things you see is, in general, for the larger revenue sources, for taxes and for total valuation, which is total property valuation, that drops out into the property tax. Our errors are pretty acceptable. In some of the smaller revenue sources, they aren't. Intergovernmental revenue is always going to be a problem. It's always more volatile, and that's just a reality. The state is not a very good partner in terms of keeping things going, and intergovernmental revenue is lumpy in the first place. And so there just tends to be a lot of error in this. And so we reflect it. It's reflective of reality, we feel. And so what we do after all of these forecasts are combined is we put all this data together. And what we use is a concept called operating balance. So we have total operating revenues and total operating expenditures. So we subtract out capital expenditures because that really wouldn't be fair to consider capital expenditures against a jurisdiction. So for 5 out of the 6 cities, that's our measure, is we take operating and revenues and operating expenditures and create a measure of what's called operating balance. For Springfield, we have to make one adjustment. Springfield has been relying very heavily on transfers from their utility, from transfers through basically a payment in lieu of taxes from the utility that appears differently. It appears as a transfer, and so that needs to be incorporated into our revenue estimates in order to give a fair sense. They've been relying on that, I think, since about fiscal year 2014 or so. And so in order to not unfairly portray the financial condition, we wanted to be consistent and include that in with their operating revenues. So here's the results. And it comes out, this is the graphs for it. There's also a number of tables and everything like that. So this is a table of our operating balance forecasts, and this is the zero line here. This would be a budget which is in balance in an operating sense, so not having to rely on any type of policy changes. So that's an important assumption here, is we're assuming that the city is not going to make any policy changes. We just want to look at how much risk there is going forward. Now, hopefully using that information, they'll use that to maybe change some policies, adjust some things, etc. In the case of Springfield, if they hit their forecast, which is the top blue line, they'll have a deficit ranging from about 10% in an operating basis for fiscal year 2019 down to a deficit of over 20% in 2024. And that's if they hit their forecasts. If they have a one standard error or one standard deviation shortfall, so this would be a relatively mild recession or a need for extra spending, that would result in anywhere between a 20% and 40% operating balance deficit. And you see that things get pretty ugly pretty fast if you end up with a 2 standard error forecast. Okay, anywhere between a 35% and an over 60% operating balance deficit. So that would have to be made up for by tax cuts, spending decreases, in other words, cutting services, or something like that. Waukegan, which is our second city, in terms of their base forecast, it looks really good. They have a slight operating fund surplus if they hit their forecasts, ranging from anywhere from about 2% to close to 7 or 8% over time. If they have a one standard deviation error, they have a deficit which is similar to what Springfield had, and they even have bigger deficits if they have 2 standard errors. They have revenue sources which tend to be a lot more volatile, and that's really what's driving the fact that there's a greater distance. And I apologize, I don't have a common scale on my vertical axis. You have to look at the numbers. And so that's as much as 100% operating balance deficit up to 2023. Again, if they don't do anything to counteract it on the way there, if they have a prolonged economic downturn. The city of Normal, again, looks pretty good if they hit their forecasts, up to upwards of a 10% deficit over time. They also have some trends which are pretty positive. Just to back up a second to Springfield, the trend is downward because Springfield hasn't been balancing its budget on an operating sense going back a few years. So they actually have some downtrends that they have to counteract if things aren't going to get worse. And the same way, at least in the stress testing sense for Waukegan, Normal, you actually have uptrends because they have some positive things going on in their revenue sources over time, which produce uptrends. However, they're still exposed to risk. It's less risk than for Waukegan or Springfield, but it's still some risk for a downturn, anywhere between a 25%, 15 to 25% operating balance deficit using a one standard error miss, down to almost a 50% deficit. Carbondale looks pretty similar to Springfield. I won't go over the numbers. I know I'm running up against time here, but they have a similar pattern. Their revenues actually kind of flatten out. It is a continual downtrend, and so things don't get as bad over time as Springfield does, but they also have a little bit more volatility, so there's a little bit more distance between the lines. Ironically, the 2 smaller cities in our sample, Geneseo and Thornton, actually appear to be in a better position from a stress testing perspective. Geneseo has been running a very lean operation, if they hit their forecast, they will have a pretty sizable surplus into the foreseeable future. And even at a plus or a -2 standard error, -2 standard error miss in terms of forecasts, they really don't have a problematic deficit, and don't have a deficit at all until far out when our uncertainty is pretty high. Thornton has a little bit more of a deficit, and their surplus looks pretty good again if you have a forecast, if they hit their forecasts. They have a small deficit on a 1 standard error miss and a larger one on a 2 standard error, but nowhere near what their other cities are. So again, what this would come with would be, some kind of a report that tells us what the outcomes would be. So what do we do? Well, we can develop economic and revenue forecast models. Like I said, we've been doing this for years. I've been providing a economic forecast and revenue forecast along with my colleague, Dr. Ari Kriz, for the city of Omaha, Nebraska since 2009. So for the last 11 years, I worked recently with New York City to use a very similar model to analyze how much they should have in budget reserves in order to withstand some economic downturns. We can perform the stress test, but we can also analyze certain scenarios. So we can look at, because we forecast the tax base separately than the tax revenues, I can look at what would be likely to happen if you changed, for example, if you put on a 0.5-cent sales tax. What would be the likely outcome in terms of your finances? So I can build a tool for you which will allow you to kind of look at these things, as well as changing expenditures and things like that. So there's a couple of issues, obviously, and this is where some of the caveats come in. The cleaner the data, the better. The more the data, the better. Again, our errors in our model are based somewhat about how much data you have, and so the farther you can go back in terms of the data, the better the model will work. But in a sense, what I would ask you to consider is, if you don't have a lot of data on the past, there really is more risk for your jurisdiction. That's just a reality. If you're unable to develop forecasts based upon data that goes back a few years, there's a lot more risk. You may not want to acknowledge it, but the risk is there because you don't have an understanding about what really is possible. You would need to work with us to develop an understanding of the financial model. So if there's anything different in your finances, like the Springfield example, understanding what the different revenue sources are, being able to adopt it to reflect reality. We're all about giving you a fair picture of how much risk is in your future. And then, one of the caveats that's always involved in this is that they're forward-looking and they assume at least somewhat the future will look like the past and the present. So I think our model, again, is stronger because we take into account more information, but it's still something where fundamentally we're trying to use a crystal ball, and none of us have that ability. And so we do recognize that we're all inferior beings, and we have to try and look at the future based upon our best understanding of the past and the present. And that's really what our model is going to do. So wrapping up, our website has the full paper. It's a working paper right now. And we're going to add more cities and then send it out for publication, and we'll let people know if it's available. There's other research there from the institute that I run, including measures of government efficiency. My co-author, our colleague, Dr. Ari Kriz, has done a very good paper looking at government efficiency, something that actually measures government efficiency, which is a lot different than what some measures purport to do. And then I have a paper on pension contribution policies based upon my time helping to manage pensions in different cities and my time in investments, working in investments. And then forthcoming, there will be working and white papers on tax policy, budget reserves, and more efficiency papers, pension papers, and fiscal sustainability. So with that, I would love to answer any questions or comments you might have.
If anyone has any questions, please put them in the group chat. We'll have Dr. Kriz respond.
Okay, Nancy asked a question on the different varying sources of revenue, and how often this would need to be updated. I think in general this should be updated every, say, 3 to 5 years. That the cycle is, there's a couple of different issues there. One issue is that you need to have updated data. The second thing is that the more times you generate these models, the smarter they get. So that a lot of the models we employ have a sense of learning within them, and so they learn the data. And so the more times we can repeat this, the more we can do this. Now, if we have enough data, there's a whole other class of models that I've done academic work on that are like the models that Amazon and Google use. They're called machine learning models or deep learning models. But you need a lot of data for that. You need to be able to go back 30 years at least in order to be able to have any type of advantage on that. And I'm aware that most communities just don't have the ability to go back. And asked about responses that communities have deployed. Well, I'm just getting out the word about this, so thanks for the question. I've gone over this with some of the communities that have been involved, and they believe that it's a fair picture of what's going on, and some of them have used it to inform their budget development. And thought about some potential actions in terms of adjusting spending or adjusting revenues. Another thing you can do, and again, this goes back to the work I did with New York City, is you can use it to adjust your budget reserves. You can put a little bit more away if you do have extra revenue above and beyond in order to provide a cushion for the future. And so that's another response. And that by the way, is also something I can produce out of this, is a sense of how much budget reserves we need. So ASHRET1 asks, how could we use the forecasting results to adjust the city financial conditions through new fiscal policy? And that kind of answers, that kind of gets at the same point, is there's a number of different responses. You could increase your tax rate. You could try and increase by economic development policy through adjusting, getting in more business into the city to increase your tax base. You could try to make changes in your spending. And the good thing about it, and I'm glad you asked it in this way, Ashrit, is that you also will have the individual forecasts for each of the different areas. And so you'll have a sense of really what's driving the results. And so in some cases, it's really spending, which is primarily driving it. So if you have a steady upward trend in spending that's high enough, and you have a volatile revenue source that goes up and down, that produces more risk for the community. And so you can look at possibly lowering your trend growth in spending in order to make the types of adjustments you need to ensure long-run solvency for the community. So thanks for those questions.
There's another question from Susan Odom.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Let me see here. Strong towns, long-term commitment resources, maintenance, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me.
And let me just say that it's good for our listeners and viewers of who will view the recording to hear the questions, since they're not going to be able to see the chat box.
All right, thanks. Well, Susan asked about the Strong Town founders suggest that communities need to consider the long-term commitment of resources for maintenance and upgrade before incorporating new roads, subdivisions, et cetera, in their communities. In a nutshell, they don't take into consideration the long-term impact of growth. Can you assist with these type of forecasts also? Yes, I can. And I'd say there's two counteracting effects there. This is based upon another paper that Dr. Ari Kriz, she was publishing under her maiden name of Ari Pawi Shithangrung then. We published in a journal called the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. We actually looked at the state level in that case, but we looked at the long-term impact of growth on spending and taxes, or spending and tax revenues, and at the same time looked at the reverse, which is the long-term effect of spending and tax revenues on growth. And so there's really two effects there, that new development through new communities, et cetera, will create more costs. And that's what I think the Strong Town founders are getting at. More resources for maintenance and upgrades to infrastructure. However, it also creates more tax base. So the real question there is, what is the trade-off? And the way that our models are built is, again, there's an economic component and there's a financial component. Right now, the economic component feeds into the financial component. The financial component doesn't go the reverse into economic. And so that's one of the things I can do is work with Dr. Ari Kriz to incorporate that a little bit more. But to answer your question, the economic growth impact into revenues and expenditures is taken into account. So yes, we very much can do that. Courtney Yockey, and I hope that answered your question, Susan. I know I'm speeding up, and I see we have about 14 minutes left. So I want to make sure I get through all the questions. Courtney Yockey asked, what about areas that experience population decline? Half of our Illinois counties will see more than 5% decline over 10 years. Are there more pressing matters that forecasts would be useful? What would a symptom that a treasurer could quickly identify that help them know that they need a forecast? Good question, Courtney. And in our model, we represent essentially population by numbers of employment. That's the variable that seems to translate it in more directly than population. I've used other models in the past. I worked on an EPA project to come up with a tool for communities to assess the sustainability of doing water infrastructure investments. And there, because of the differences in levels, we were looking more at a kind of a state level, et cetera. Population seemed to work pretty well. But as your population declines, probably still, so will your employment number, and so will a lot of your economic numbers. And so that's the primary means that I think you'll see about population declines working out within the model here. And again, this is something that on a bespoke level, we can actually take the time to try and sort out is whether population may make more sense to look at. The thing I would kind of be careful about that is, again, this is a forecast. And I think that forecast is it's a lot easier to forecast population than economic numbers for just a lot of reasons, which are too difficult to get into. But it is a population. I saw population forecasts for the last state I lived in. Having moved here only a couple of years ago, I'm still learning Illinois. But in Kansas, where I used to live, I saw population forecasts that ended up being off pretty substantially because they assumed, for example, that birth rates would continue to decline, and they've actually leveled off considerably. And so, again, this is a forecast. The way I would think about it is, how does a population decline translate into something economic or something fiscal? And I haven't seen convincing evidence that there's a lot of effect at the local government level for that right now.
Okay, thank you. And we will be sending out this presentation to everyone. So if you have any more questions for Dr. Kriz, we'll have his contact information. I know this is technical information. I direct you to the screen. We are asking you to respond to a poll by clicking the appropriate choice on your screen. So I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. Thank you, Dr. Kriz.
Oh, you're welcome, Mike. Glad to be here.
Great, thank you. We hope you all be able to join us next month on March 26th for our next webinar. It's Preparing for Extreme Weather, where presenters from the Illinois State Water Survey will discuss the science impacts of climate change as they relate to water in Illinois. Following the presentation, Illinois State Water Survey engineer and hydrologist Sally McConkey will explain where to find floodplain information, how to interpret a floodplain map, and further important information. Participants will be able to ask questions during the Q&A following the presentation. We will also be hosting webinar sessions on the next 2 consecutive Fridays, which is tomorrow and next Friday, for Connect Illinois Broadband Infrastructure funding. Complete information will be emailed to you in a follow-up email. You may also visit our website to register for this and other future webinars at go.illinois.edu/LGE, capital LGE. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody, for attending, and have a great day.